Some people think they can treat others however they want just because they hold a little power. They assume no one will challenge them, that their cruelty will go unnoticed, that their victims will stay silent. But not this time. Meet Lucas Bennett, a 10-year-old boy with a sharp mind, a kind heart, and a spirit stronger than most adults. But in the eyes of certain people, none of that matters. Because Lucas is black, because he's disabled, because he doesn't belong in their world. And then there's Clara Bennett, his mother, a woman who has fought her entire life to protect her son, to give him everything the world tries to deny him. But no matter how much she fights, there are always people like Monica Reed, people who see only what they want to see, people who mistake kindness for weakness. On this flight, Monica thought she was untouchable. She thought she could strip Lucas of his dignity, force him out of first class, and get away with it. She thought no one would stand up to her. She had no idea who she was dealing with. Because what happens next will change everything, not just for Lucas and Clara, but for everyone watching. Before we begin, let us know, where are you watching from? Have you ever witnessed discrimination like this? Tell us your thoughts in the comments. And if you love stories of justice, karma, and powerful comebacks, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Now buckle up. This flight is about to take an unexpected turn. The flight was set to depart, and the atmosphere in first class settled into a quiet hum of conversations and the occasional clinking of glasses. Lucas adjusted himself in his wheelchair, his small hands gripping the armrests, as he prepared to transfer to his seat. Clara positioned herself, ready to help, but before she could lift her son, Monica stepped forward, blocking the aisle. "Wait," Monica said flatly. Her eyes darted between Clara and Lucas, a flicker of impatience in her gaze. "We need to follow proper procedures for special accommodations. Let me get someone from ground staff." Clara frowned. "I can help him myself. We do this all the time." Monica shook her head, her smile thin and insincere. "Regulations. Please, just wait." Lucas bit his lip. He hated being the center of attention, and now, with passengers already peering over their seats, he felt every second stretch unbearably long. Monica stood there, arms crossed, making no effort to actually call for help. Minutes passed. People whispered. Clara clenched her fists. A man sitting nearby, a well-dressed executive in his 40s, sighed loudly. "For God's sake, just let them sit down. This isn't complicated." Monica shot him a tight smile, then turned back to Clara. "Fine, but you'll need to be quick. We can't delay departure." Clara bent down, wrapping an arm around Lucas. He was small for his age, but transferring him without assistance in the narrow aisle wasn't easy. She struggled, trying not to show how much effort it took. Lucas's body tensed as he tried to help, but his legs refused to cooperate. As Clara finally got him into a seat, Monica let out an audible sigh and muttered, "This is why we have separate boarding procedures." The words stung. Clara ignored them, adjusting Lucas's seatbelt while he kept his gaze fixed on the floor. A few minutes later, a flight attendant passed through, offering passengers complimentary drinks. When she reached Clara and Lucas, Monica intercepted. "No need to serve them yet," she said casually. "They might be moving." Clara's head snapped up. "Moving?" Monica gave a nonchalant shrug. "I'm still checking if there's a more suitable seat elsewhere." Clara took a deep breath, steadying herself. "We booked these seats months ago. We are not moving." Monica smiled, the kind that wasn't meant to be kind. "Let's just see how the flight goes." Lucas pressed himself against a seat, silent, wishing he could disappear. He could feel the weight of every glance, hear the murmurs from nearby passengers. His mother's grip on his hand tightened, a quiet reassurance. But he knew this wasn't over. The cabin of first class buzzed with quiet luxury as passengers settled in, flipping through magazines or adjusting their seats. The faint scent of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air, blending with the polished leather and high-end cologne of the businessmen in tailored suits. But for Lucas and Clara, the comfort promised by their first-class tickets had already been shattered. Lucas sat in his wheelchair, his small fingers gripping the armrests. He hated being the center of attention, but the way Monica Reed hovered over them, her arms crossed, an expression unreadable, made it impossible to fade into the background. "Just wait here a moment," Monica said. Her voice clipped as she looked at Clara. "I need to check something before you move him to the seat." Clara frowned. "Check what?" Monica sighed, as if explaining something tedious. "Regulations require us to ensure that passengers with special needs are properly accommodated. I need to see if we can find a better arrangement." Clara's grip tightened on the handles of Lucas's wheelchair. "We don't need a better arrangement. We have these seats. We booked them months ago." Monica's gaze flickered down to Lucas before returning to Clara. "I understand, ma'am, but we have to consider all passengers. The first-class cabin isn't always the most," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "convenient for these situations." Clara inhaled sharply. "My son is not a situation. And we don't need special treatment. We just need you to let us take our seats." Monica hesitated, her lips pressing together in a tight line. A man sitting in the row ahead, dressed in an expensive navy blue suit, sighed loudly. "For God's sake, just let them sit down. Some of us would like to take off on time." Monica's smile was thin and forced. "Of course, sir." Then, turning back to Clara, she stepped aside. "Fine, you may proceed." Clara ignored the irritation in Monica's tone and bent down to help Lucas. The aisle was narrow, and lifting her son from the wheelchair to the seat required precision and strength. Lucas braced himself, pressing his hands against the wheelchair frame, but his legs refused to cooperate. Clara wrapped an arm around his small waist and began the transfer. Her muscles strained, but she was used to this. She had done it 1,000 times before, in doctors' offices, at home, in restaurants that lacked proper accessibility. Yet here, in a cabin designed for comfort, the process felt unnecessarily difficult. Monica stood there, watching with an expression that barely hid her impatience. As Clara finally secured Lucas in his seat and adjusted his seatbelt, Monica let out an audible sigh. "This is why we have separate boarding procedures," she muttered. Lucas looked down, his face burning. Clara clenched her jaw, but chose to stay silent. A few minutes later, a flight attendant passed through, offering passengers complimentary drinks. The crisp white linen of the serving tray contrasted with a shimmering golden liquid inside the champagne flutes. When the attendant reached Clara and Lucas, Monica intercepted her with a subtle wave of her hand. "Hold off on serving them for now," Monica said quietly. "There might be a seating adjustment." Clara's head snapped up. "What did you just say?" Monica smiled, the same forced expression as before. "I'm just checking if there's a more suitable seat available." Clara's voice was sharp. "We are not moving. These are our seats." Monica tilted her head slightly. "Let's just see how the flight goes, shall we?" The implied threat hung in the air. Lucas sat stiffly, his hands folded in his lap. He had learned from a young age to recognize moments when it was better to stay quiet. His mother was strong, always fighting for him, but he knew she was exhausted. He could see it in the tightness of her shoulders, in the way she was gripping her own hands now to keep from lashing out. The minutes ticked by, and Clara turned away from Monica, signaling the conversation was over. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small travel pillow. "Here, baby," she whispered, placing it behind Lucas's back for extra support. Monica scoffed. "First-class pillows are meant for premium passengers." "Not." She glanced at Lucas, but left the sentence unfinished. Clara stilled. Her fingers curled into a fist, then slowly released. "That's fine," she said quietly. Lucas swallowed hard. He wished he could disappear. A few rows ahead, the businessman who had spoken up earlier shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He wasn't looking at them anymore. No one was. People hated confrontation, even when it was unfolding right in front of them. The engines rumbled, signaling that takeoff was near. Monica turned and walked away, satisfied. Lucas stared out the window, refusing to let the tears sting his eyes. This was supposed to be a special trip, but now he just wanted it to be over. Monica moved through the aisle, her presence looming. Every glance she cast toward Lucas carried that same undercurrent of condescension, an unspoken message. You don't belong here. Clara took a slow breath, forcing herself to focus on Lucas, not on Monica's piercing gaze. Are you okay, sweetheart? She whispered. Lucas nodded quickly, not trusting his voice. His mother had fought enough battles for him. He didn't want to give her another one. A flight attendant wheeled the food cart down the aisle, offering trays to the first-class passengers. Silverware gleamed, and the scent of freshly cooked meals filled the cabin. Lucas's stomach rumbled faintly. He wasn't even hungry anymore, just tired. When the attendant reached them, she hesitated. Before she could speak, Monica appeared at her side. No need, Monica said smoothly. They won't be needing a full meal service. Clara's eyes darkened. Excuse me. Monica put on her practiced, tight-lipped smile. I just assumed, given the situation, that something lighter might be more appropriate. She nodded toward Lucas, as if he were an inconvenience, not a child. Lucas swallowed hard, his ears burning. We'll take exactly what every other passenger is getting, Clara said, her voice calm but firm. Monica sighed dramatically, as if she were indulging a tantrum. Very well. She motioned for the attendant to hand them their trays, but not before making a point to sigh again. Lucas tried to steady his trembling fingers as he reached for his cup of water. The turbulence hit at the same moment, just a light jolt, but enough to make his grip falter. The plastic cup slipped, tipping over onto the tray table. Water splashed onto his lap, and for a moment he just stared, stunned. The silence was thick. Then Monica's voice rang out, sharp and loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. Oh, wonderful, she scoffed. First-class service at its finest. Lucas flinched. He scrambled to grab a napkin, his hand shaking, but before he could mop up the spill, Monica waved over another attendant. Clean this up, she ordered, stepping back as if the water posed a personal offense to her. Quickly, before it becomes an even bigger mess. The other passengers turned. Some looked away just as quickly, uncomfortable but unwilling to interfere. A few murmured, casting sidelong glances at Clara and Lucas. Accidents happen, Clara said tightly, reaching for more napkins. Monica gave her a saccharine smile. Of course, but I do think this confirms my earlier point. She gestured toward the spill. Perhaps this environment isn't exactly suited for, her gaze flicked to Lucas's wheelchair. Certain needs. Lucas felt his stomach drop. Clara's grip on her napkin tightened. And what exactly do you mean by that? Monica clasped her hands together, her tone patronizing. I just think it might be easier if he were somewhere with more space, more appropriate accommodations. Lucas felt the words before he even heard them. He could see it coming. Like a slow-moving train, inevitable and unstoppable. You mean moving us to economy, Clara said, her voice flat. Monica gave a small, faux apologetic shrug. Only if it makes things more comfortable. No, Clara said immediately. We're staying right here. Monica sighed again, then turned toward the rest of the cabin, raising her voice just enough to let the nearby passengers hear. I'm simply trying to make the flight experience smoother for everyone. Lucas heard it then, the shift in the air. The way some passengers now looked at them with mild irritation instead of indifference. They weren't just a mother and son anymore. They were now the problem. I'll speak to the captain, Monica announced. We'll see if something can be arranged. Lucas shrank into his seat, his pulse pounding in his ears. This was worse than being ignored. This was being actively removed. Clara didn't move, didn't blink. You do that. Monica turned on her heel, walking toward the front of the plane. Lucas could still feel the weight of Monica's words hanging over him, the way her voice had carried through the cabin, making sure everyone knew she was pushing them out. His heart pounded as he stole a glance at his mother. Clara's face was carefully composed, but he knew that look. The way her jaw was set, the way her fingers gripped the napkin she had used to clean up a spill. She was furious. Monica returned, a self-satisfied smirk playing at the corners of her lips. The captain has been informed, she announced, making sure her voice was loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear. We'll be relocating you shortly. Clara's hands tightened into fists. "You are not moving us." Monica let out an exaggerated sigh, as if Clara was being difficult on purpose. "Ma'am, I'm simply following procedure. I really think this will be better for everyone." Her gaze dropped to Lucas, her expression unreadable, but the message was clear. "You don't belong here." Lucas wanted to say something, to tell her she was wrong, that he had every right to sit in this seat, just like the businessman in the expensive suit or the woman across the aisle scrolling through her phone. But the words wouldn't come. His throat felt tight. Clara started to stand. "I want to speak to the captain myself." Monica's expression hardened. "Ma'am, I suggest you take your seat. This situation is already disruptive enough." Clara didn't move. Monica took a step closer. "Sit down." The two women locked eyes, the tension crackling between them. And then, without warning, Monica reached for Lucas's wheelchair. Lucas barely had time to react before he felt a sudden jolt. Monica's hands gripping the handles of his chair, yanking it back away from the row. His breath caught in his throat as his body lurched, the unexpected movement making him feel weightless for a split second before the wheels hit the carpet again. Panic shot through him. His hands scrambled for the armrests, his muscles tensing instinctively. "Stop." Clara's voice cut through the cabin. She grabbed the chair, yanking it back toward her with such force that Monica stumbled slightly. "Do not touch my son." A hush fell over the surrounding passengers. The businessman who had complained earlier was now staring, his brows furrowed. A middle-aged woman in a navy blouse, Emma Clark, put down her book, her mouth slightly open. Monica straightened, smoothing down the front of her uniform, but her expression had darkened. "I am trying to help," she said, her voice icy. "No, you're not," Clara shot back. "You're trying to humiliate us." Lucas's breath came in short bursts. His hands were shaking, but he clenched them into fists, trying to steady himself. He had never felt so powerless. Emma finally spoke. "Excuse me, but this is ridiculous." Monica's head snapped toward her. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you." Emma raised an eyebrow. "It does when I'm forced to watch a child be mistreated." She turned to the other passengers. "Is anyone else seeing this?" A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the rows. Others shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. Monica's smile returned, but it was sharper now, edged with irritation. "This is a private matter between the airline and its passengers." Emma scoffed. "That's an interesting way to describe discrimination." Monica's eyes flashed. "If you have a complaint, I suggest you file it after landing." Clara stepped forward, placing herself between Monica and Lucas. Her voice was quieter now, but it carried more weight than any shout could. "You are not going to put your hands on my son again." Monica's jaw clenched. She took a deep breath, her fingers curling at her sides. Then, slowly, she stepped back. "Fine." Clara didn't move until she was sure Monica was at a safe distance. Then, kneeling beside Lucas, she placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Are you okay?" Lucas nodded quickly, not trusting his voice. The tension in the cabin remained thick, but no one spoke. Monica turned sharply on her heel and stormed toward the front of the plane, disappearing behind the curtain that separated first class from the cockpit. Lucas let out a shaky breath. His mother's hand remained firm on his shoulder, grounding him. Emma leaned forward slightly, her voice quieter now. "You need to report her when you land." Clara gave a small, grim nod. "Oh, I will." Lucas had spent his entire life trying to prove that he was just as capable as everyone else. But Monica had reduced him to something less with a single callous action. Clara remained by his side, her protective hand still resting on his shoulder. Her body was tense, her jaw locked, her entire presence screaming defiance. Lucas knew his mother, knew the storm brewing beneath the surface. But he also knew Monica wasn't finished. The curtain at the front of the first-class cabin rustled, and Monica reappeared, this time with a smug satisfaction plastered across her face. She didn't even glance at Clara or Lucas as she strode confidently to the intercom panel, her posture rigid with self-importance. She picked up the handset and spoke, her voice ringing clearly through the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the slight delay. Her eyes flickered toward Lucas and Clara, a predatory glint in them. Our priority at Skylink Airlines is to ensure the most comfortable and exclusive experience for our first-class passengers. However, when certain circumstances interfere with that experience, we must take appropriate action. A murmur spread through the cabin. Heads turned. Eyes locked onto Lucas and his mother. Monica continued, her tone feigning professionalism. To maintain the high standard of service expected in this section, we will be making adjustments. We appreciate your patience. She hung up the intercom and turned, her sharp gaze landing on Clara. Security has been notified. They'll be arriving shortly to assist you in relocating to a more suitable part of the plane. Clara's face remained unreadable, but her fingers curled tighter around the armrest. We are not moving. Monica's expression didn't waver. Ma'am, at this point, you don't have a choice. A ripple of unease spread through the passengers. Some turned their attention back to their drinks and tablets, eager to avoid the confrontation, but a few openly watched, their eyes darting between Monica and Clara. Emma Clark, still seated nearby, crossed her arms. This is outrageous. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried enough weight that several passengers turned toward her. This isn't about comfort. This is about discrimination. Monica shot Emma a tight, insincere smile. I appreciate your concern, ma'am, but I assure you, this is an operational decision. Emma scoffed. Oh, please. We all heard what you just said. She turned to the businessman across the aisle, the one who had earlier sighed impatiently. And are you really okay with this? The businessman hesitated. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly weighing whether or not he wanted to get involved. Finally, he muttered, It's not really my place. Emma's lips pressed into a thin line. Of course it isn't. Lucas stared down at his lap, his stomach twisting. He didn't want this. He didn't want his mother fighting for him, didn't want Emma defending him. He just wanted to sit in his seat like everyone else. He just wanted to disappear. Then he heard the footsteps. Heavy, purposeful. 2 uniformed airline security officers entered the cabin. They were large men, their expressions blank but firm, their presence alone enough to command silence. Monica straightened, folding her arms, a picture of victory. The taller officer, a man with graying hair and a deep voice, spoke first. Ma'am, we need you to come with us. Clara stood slowly, meeting his gaze. And if I refuse? The officer hesitated. We don't want to escalate this. Monica's smile widened. We're simply offering a better alternative. Clara exhaled sharply. For whom? Lucas felt the burn behind his eyes. He wanted to be strong, wanted to prove Monica wrong, but the humiliation was unbearable. The weight of so many eyes watching him, judging him, whispering about him. It was too much. Monica, sensing weakness, took a step forward. Look, she said, voice dripping with false sympathy. I know this is frustrating, but wouldn't it just be easier if you cooperated? I mean, why make a scene? Lucas swallowed hard. He could feel the tears threatening to spill, but he refused to let them fall. Then, Monica did something unforgivable. She crouched slightly, lowering her voice just enough that only he and Clara could hear. Sweetheart, she cooed, her tone sickeningly sweet. Don't you want to be where you belong? The dam almost broke. Lucas's breath hitched, his chest tightening painfully. He bit the inside of his cheek hard enough to taste blood. His mother was still talking, still fighting, but his world had narrowed to just those words, repeating over and over in his head. Where you belong. The officer cleared his throat. Ma'am, this is our final request. A long silence stretched between them. Clara looked at Lucas. He met her gaze, his eyes wide, pleading, but not because he wanted to stay, because he wanted it to end. She understood. Clara closed her eyes briefly, then turned back to the officers. Fine. A triumphant smile flickered across Monica's lips, but Clara wasn't done. We'll move, she said, her voice steady, but you haven't heard the last of this. Monica's smirk faltered. Clara bent down, brushing a hand over Lucas's curls, before straightening. "Let's go, baby." Lucas nodded stiffly, his face expressionless. The officers stepped back, allowing them to pass. The walk down the aisle felt endless. Each step was a silent battle, each whispered murmur a dagger to the heart. When they finally reached economy, Clara settled Lucas into his new seat, her movements careful but mechanical. She leaned in close, whispering just for him. The air in economy felt different. It wasn't just the smaller seats, the narrower aisles, or the absence of luxury. It was the eyes, the quiet, pitying glances from other passengers who had witnessed the humiliation unfold. Some averted their gaze, pretending not to see, while others looked at Clara and Lucas with an expression that bordered on sympathy but carried the weight of helplessness. Lucas sat in his new seat, staring blankly at the tray table in front of him. His chest felt tight, his face hot. His hands trembled slightly, though he clenched them into fists to stop the shaking. He wasn't going to cry. He refused. He had already lost too much today. His dignity, his place, his sense of belonging. He wouldn't let Monica take his pride too. Clara was silent beside him. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she was forcing herself to stay in control. Lucas could see it, the way her shoulders were tense, the way she exhaled through her nose in slow, measured breaths. He had seen her angry before, but never like this. Then, she reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a second, hesitating, before she unlocked it. Lucas glanced at her hands. They were shaking. She tapped out a message quickly, her jaw tightening. Lucas swallowed hard. "Mom." His voice was small, barely above a whisper. Clara didn't look at him at first. She hit send, then locked the phone, gripping it tightly in her lap, as if trying to stop herself from hurling it across the cabin. Finally, she turned to him, her expression softening despite the storm raging beneath it. "Yes, baby." Lucas hesitated. Then, in the smallest voice, he murmured, "I don't want to be here." Clara's face broke for just a second, a crack in her carefully held composure. She reached out, brushing his curls gently with her fingers. "I know," she whispered. "I know, sweetheart." Lucas blinked rapidly, forcing the tears back. He sniffled and pressed his forehead against her shoulder. "Mẹ ơi, con không muốn mọi người thấy con khóc." His voice was barely audible, but Clara heard every word. She tightened her arms around him, shielding him as best as she could. A few rows ahead, a flight attendant, one of the younger ones, not Monica, hesitated near the curtain separating economy from first class. She looked conflicted, glancing back and forth between Clara and whatever conversation was happening beyond the curtain. The engines rumbled beneath them, the familiar vibrations signaling that takeoff was moments away. Lucas sat stiffly in his seat, his fingers still gripping his mother's hand. His chest was tight, and even though Clara held him close, he still felt cold, like something inside him had cracked and couldn't be fixed. The humiliation clung to him, suffocating, pressing down on his ribs like a weight too heavy to bear. Clara's phone vibrated in her lap. She glanced down, her lips pressing into a thin line before unlocking the screen. Lucas watched as her expression didn't change, no relief, no satisfaction. Just a steady, quiet focus as her fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard. Then she put the phone away and exhaled, a slow, measured breath. Lucas didn't ask who she had texted. He just tightened his grip on her fingers. She squeezed back. Meanwhile, up front in the cockpit, Captain Ethan Harper adjusted his headset, glancing at the flight log one last time before preparing for takeoff. Everything was in place. The flight crew was seated. The runway was clear. Then his radio crackled. "Captain Harper, you need to delay takeoff immediately." Harper frowned. That wasn't air traffic control. It was coming directly from corporate headquarters. His fingers hovered over the controls. "Come again." The voice on the other end was sharp, urgent. "Do not take off. Hold position and report to the lead flight attendant now." A cold prickle ran down Harper's spine. The only time corporate interrupted a flight like this was for something big. He flicked the intercom and turned to his co-pilot. "Hold position," he muttered before unbuckling his seatbelt and standing. In the first-class cabin, Monica was just smoothing her uniform when Harper strode in, his face tight. "Monica," he said, his voice low but commanding. She blinked, surprised. "Captain, we're about to take off. We have a situation." His gaze was sharp, locked onto hers in a way that made her shoulders stiffen. Passengers started to take notice. Murmurs rippled through first class as Harper pulled Monica aside, lowering his voice. "I just got a direct call from the executive board." Monica arched a brow, unimpressed. "And?" Harper exhaled sharply, glancing toward the economy section. "Monica, you just made a huge mistake." Monica's smirk faltered for the first time. "Excuse me." Harper's jaw clenched. "The boy. The one you humiliated in front of the entire cabin. Do you have any idea who he is?" Monica rolled her eyes. "Some last-minute upgrade who shouldn't have been in first class?" Harper took a step closer, his voice just above a whisper. "That last-minute upgrade is Lucas Bennett." Monica's brow furrowed. "And that's supposed to mean something to me?" Harper inhaled through his nose. "His father is Victor Bennett." Monica blinked. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but it wasn't until Harper's next words that the blood drained from her face. "He owns this airline." The cabin remained tense as Lucas sat stiffly in his seat. His hands remained clenched together, his face blank, but his mind raced. He could still hear the whispers spreading through the passengers around him. Some people kept their eyes forward, pretending not to notice, while others exchanged murmurs filled with curiosity and confusion. A pair of heavy footsteps echoed through the aisle, moving with authority. The sound was steady and deliberate, cutting through the hum of the aircraft. Lucas looked up just as Captain Ethan Harper approached. The captain's usually unreadable expression was now laced with something almost hesitant. Without a word, he lowered himself to one knee beside Lucas's seat, bringing himself to the boy's eye level. "Lucas," Harper said, his voice measured but carrying a newfound sense of respect. "You are Lucas Bennett, correct?" Lucas hesitated for a moment before giving a small nod. He wasn't sure why the captain was addressing him directly, but something in the man's tone made his chest tighten. Harper exhaled slowly. His next words were careful, almost weighted. "Your father has been notified," he said. "He is on his way." A soft gasp came from somewhere nearby. Passengers who had been watching with mild curiosity now sat up straighter. Lucas blinked. His father was coming? He hadn't expected that. His father was a powerful man, always busy, always handling things from afar. But now he was coming here? A voice from first class cut through the air. "Wait, who's his father?" Harper stood up. His expression remained serious as he faced the cabin. He spoke with the kind of authority that made people listen. "Victor Bennett," he said, "owner and CEO of Skylink Airlines." The reaction was immediate. Silence spread through the rows. A woman in a business suit turned sharply in her seat, her eyes widening. A man wearing a Rolex whispered something to his companion, his fingers tightening around his drink. Even the flight attendants near the galley exchanged nervous glances. And then there was Monica. She stood near the first-class section, her body suddenly rigid. The confidence she had worn so proudly before had vanished in an instant. Her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to say something, but no words came out. Harper shifted his gaze toward her. His voice remained calm, but there was a clear undercurrent of disappointment. "You knew they had first-class tickets. You knew they had every right to be here." Monica's throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. Her hands, which had been neatly clasped in front of her, slowly curled into fists. I didn't." Harper didn't let her finish. He turned back to Clara, his posture softening slightly. "Mrs. Bennett, I sincerely apologize for what happened today." Clara finally spoke. Her voice was even, but her eyes held the quiet strength of someone who had been fighting battles for far too long. "An apology doesn't erase what was done." Harper nodded, accepting the weight of her words. "No, it doesn't." He glanced toward the cockpit, then back at her. "But I assure you, Mr. Bennett will handle this personally." Lucas felt something shift inside him. He wasn't sure if it was relief or something heavier. But for the first time since stepping onto this plane, he didn't feel small. The power she had wielded so effortlessly over Lucas and Clara was gone. Her lips parted, but no words came out at first. When she finally found her voice, it was no longer the sharp, confident tone she had used before. It was shaky, almost pleading. "Captain Harper, I didn't know," she stammered, her face paling. "I was just following policy." Clara, who had remained seated this entire time, finally stood up. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She turned to Monica, her gaze sharp. "No," she said, her voice steady and unforgiving. "You were following your own prejudice." Monica's face burned with shame. She turned desperately to Harper. "I didn't mean any harm. I was just trying to maintain order in first class." Harper's jaw tightened. "Order." His voice was low, controlled, but laced with disgust. "Is that what you call humiliating a child? Denying a paying passenger a seat? Mocking someone for needing accommodations?" Monica took a small step back. It was a misunderstanding." Clara let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "A misunderstanding? You deliberately tried to make my son feel like he was less than everyone else on this plane. You wanted him to believe he didn't belong." Monica opened her mouth again, but a voice cut through the cabin before she could speak. "Where's my son?" The deep, commanding tone silenced everyone. A new wave of whispers erupted as Victor Bennett appeared at the entrance of the aircraft. He was a tall, imposing man in his late 40s, dressed in a dark suit that exuded wealth and power. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were locked on one person, Monica. Passengers turned in their seats, recognizing the man whose name had been spoken just moments ago. Some pulled out their phones, discreetly recording what was happening. Victor took a step forward, his presence filling the space. "I asked a question," he said, his voice like thunder before storm. "Where is my son?" Harper, composed despite the tension in the air, took a small step aside, revealing Lucas and Clara. Victor's expression softened just slightly when his gaze landed on his son. In an instant, he crossed the cabin and knelt beside Lucas, just as Harper had moments before. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentler now, but still firm. Lucas nodded slowly. He wasn't sure what to say. His father had always been larger than life, but he had never seen him this intense. Victor exhaled, brushing a hand over his son's curls before standing to his full height. Then he turned to Monica. The fear in her eyes was unmistakable. Victor's expression was unreadable, but his words were cold as steel. "Do you have any idea," he said, pausing to let the weight of his words sink in, "who you just humiliated?" Monica's breath hitched. "Mr. Bennett, I didn't know you didn't know," Victor repeated, nodding slowly. "So let me educate you." He took a step closer, towering over her. "You humiliated my son. You degraded my family. And you tarnished the name of my airline." Monica swallowed hard. "Sir, please, I can explain. There's nothing to explain." His voice was final, unforgiving. The silence in the cabin was suffocating. Harper straightened, clearing his throat. "Mr. Bennett, I've already contacted corporate. We've delayed takeoff until this matter is resolved." Victor didn't look away from Monica. "Good." Lucas, still seated beside his mother, felt his heart pounding. He had never seen his father like this before. His usual quiet authority had hardened into something unmovable. Monica took another step back, her hands shaking. "Please, Mr. Bennett, I didn't mean to." Victor's eyes darkened. "You didn't mean to?" His voice was dangerously low now. "You didn't mean to mock my son in front of the entire cabin? You didn't mean to rip him from his seat like he was a problem to be removed?" Monica's breathing grew unsteady. "I made a mistake." Victor's next words were final. "Yes, you did." Monica's breath came in short, uneven gasps. She had spent years building her career, perfecting the polished persona of a respected flight attendant. Yet, in a matter of minutes, she had lost everything. Her mind scrambled for a way out, a way to salvage what was left. "Mr. Bennett, please," she begged, her voice barely above a whisper. It was just a misunderstanding." Victor's expression didn't change. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. No, it wasn't. Without breaking eye contact, he pulled out his phone and pressed a single number. Within seconds, someone on the other end answered. "This is Victor Bennett," he said, his tone sharp. "I need an immediate termination issued for Monica Reed, effective now." Monica's knees nearly buckled. No, please. I've worked here for 15 years. I've given everything to this airline." Victor's eyes narrowed. "And yet you had no problem degrading my son in front of an entire cabin of passengers." Monica's lips trembled. Harper, standing beside Victor, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. He had seen flight attendants fired before, but never this fast. Never with this level of finality. A crackling sound came through Victor's phone as the executive on the other end responded. "Understood, Mr. Bennett. Monica Reed's employment will be terminated immediately." Monica let out a strangled sound, somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Victor ended the call. "Collect your things," he said. "You will be escorted off this plane." The security officers, who had once been summoned to remove Lucas and Clara, now stepped forward toward Monica instead. Passengers watched in stunned silence as the tables completely turned. The same woman who had strutted through first class with unchecked arrogance now looked small, powerless. Emma Clark, the middle-aged woman who had spoken up earlier, crossed her arms and exhaled. "Well," she said, loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear, "justice finally showed up to this flight." A few people actually clapped. Monica turned toward them, her face burning with humiliation, but no one met her gaze with sympathy. She had lost their respect the moment she chose to humiliate a child. Victor turned away from her, as if she no longer existed. His attention was now solely on Lucas. He knelt beside his son again, brushing a hand over his curls. "Are you okay?" Lucas hesitated. He had spent the past few hours feeling small, feeling powerless, feeling like he didn't belong. But now, as he looked at his father, at the stunned passengers, at Monica being escorted away, he felt something different. He felt seen. "I'm okay," he finally said. His voice was quiet but steady. Victor nodded, then stood. His gaze swept over the stunned passengers. "I trust that everyone now understands how my airline treats all of its passengers," he said, regardless of age, ability, or background. Some passengers lowered their heads in shame. Others, including Emma Clark, nodded in silent approval. Victor turned back to Harper. "We'll be returning to our original seats." Harper didn't hesitate. "Of course, Mr. Bennett." With that, Clara took Lucas's hand, and together they made their way back to first class. Passengers stepped aside as they passed. No one questioned their presence anymore. No one whispered or cast judgmental looks. Instead, they watched with quiet respect. Lucas settled back into his seat, this time without hesitation. Clara sat beside him, her expression unreadable. She had fought a battle today, but she had won. Victor adjusted his cuffs before facing his son again. "You handled that well," he said. Lucas hesitated. Then softly he asked, "Dad?" Victor knelt down once more. "Yeah." Lucas glanced toward Monica, who was being led off the plane in silence. "Should I forgive her?" Victor studied his son for a long moment. Then he exhaled and spoke with gentle wisdom. "That's up to you," he said. "But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It just means you don't let someone else's actions define who you are." Lucas thought about that. Then, slowly, he shook his head. Victor nodded in understanding. "Then that's your answer." Lucas leaned back in his seat, finally feeling at peace. The end. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how justice takes flight. What do you think? Did Monica get what she deserved? Would you have forgiven her if you were in Lucas's shoes? Let us know in the comments. Also, where are you watching from? We love hearing from our viewers all over the world. If you enjoyed this story and want more powerful tales of justice, karma, and unexpected twists, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. See you in the next story.